Have you ever looked at a massive cultural achievement, like a sprawling temple complex or a widely used currency, and just wondered, who actually came up with the blueprint? Like, who was the real brains behind the operation? Well, in this explainer, we're putting on our investigative historian hats to uncover a massive cultural catalyst that, honestly, almost slipped through the cracks of time entirely. We're talking about a dynasty that ruled between the 5th and 7th centuries CE. And they didn't just rule, they fundamentally rewired the religious, linguistic, and architectural DNA of an entire subcontinent. We are talking about the Vishnukundin kings of Andhra. Think about the really grand, globally recognized rock-cut monuments of South India. Places like Mahabalipuram, right? The ones that draw literal millions of visitors. We naturally just assume these marvels sprang fully formed from the minds of the famous giant empires that built them. But what if I told you that the iconic monuments we know today have a relatively obscure, forgotten origin story? What if the massive empires taking all the credit were actually, well, kind of just copying the homework of a much smaller, earlier dynasty? Let's figure out exactly who laid the foundation for South India's greatest temples. All right, let's get right into it. Section 1, the Undavalli Cave Mystery. So imagine you're standing near modern-day Vijayawada in Andhra Pradesh. You look up at this sheer rock face, and it's carved into a stunning, multi-story structure. Inside, you're hit with this incredibly tactile reality of layered history. The absolute centerpiece is a spectacular, 5-meter-long reclining statue of the Hindu god Vishnu as Padmanabha carved right out of the living rock. It's breathtaking. But here is the secret. This whole complex actually started off as a Buddhist shrine. The Vishnukundins came in later and added the crucial final layer, basically stamping an entirely new religious identity onto an existing spiritual space. To really grasp the magnitude of what they did, you have to look at the stark cultural pivot they engineered. Before the Vishnukundins declared independence around 420 CE, the ruling powers, like the Satavahanas and Ikshvakus, were mainly patrons of Buddhism. The state language was Prakrit, and their coins, they featured a humped bowl. But the Vishnukundins came in and completely flipped the operating system. They ushered in Hinduism, specifically Shaivism and Vaishnavism. They pivoted the official state language over to Sanskrit, and they swapped out that humped bull for a fierce, roaring lion on their coins. Moving on to Section 2, Transition to Hindu Worship. So, who was the architect of this massive cultural overhaul? Well, it was primarily King Madhavarman I, who ruled from 461 to 508 CE. He spearheaded this huge revival of Shaivism and Vaishnavism. But, religion doesn't just exist in a vacuum, it needs a voice. By replacing Prakrit with Sanskrit as the standard language of the state, he wasn't just updating bureaucratic paperwork, he was deliberately aligning the entire government with the language of these newly revived Hindi texts and rituals. It was a total game changer. Which brings us to Section 3, Pioneering Rock-Cut Architecture. Okay, so you have a new state religion and a new state language. But where do the people actually go to worship? The Vishnukundins needed physical monuments to anchor this whole shift, and in doing so, they became absolute architectural pioneers. I mean, they were responsible for the very first Hindu rock-cut temples in the entire region, carving their devotion directly into the earth. Locations like Undavalli, Magalajapuram, and Bhairavankonda aren't just ancient ruins. They are quite literally the original prototypes for Hindu ritual worship spaces in Andhra Pradesh. And this brilliantly illustrates why they matter so much to the broader history of India. Listen to this. Back in 1917, Professor G.J. de Breuil pointed out that the legendary Pallava king Mahendravarman I was so inspired by these Vishnukundin cave temples that he essentially, he copied their homework. He commissioned very similar rock-cut shrines across his own vast kingdom, and yes, that includes the world-famous monuments at Mahabalipuram. The Pallavas get all the tourist glory today, for sure, but the Vishnukundins, they provided the undeniable blueprint. Let's shift gears a bit. Section 4, the Roaring Lion Coins. Outside of temples, coinage is our main window into their empire. And man, they were incredibly innovative with their money. At the time, the standard practice was that you either poured molten metal into a mold or you hammered a design onto a blank piece of metal. But the Vishnukundins uniquely did both. First, they cast the metal to get a perfectly circular blank disc. Then, they stamped their intricate designs right on top. This tactile, double-layered process, it showed a highly sophisticated level of state control. And the symbolism they chose for these coins was a really bold statement. Scrapping the old Satavahana humped bowl, they stamped the front of their coins with a fierce, roaring lion. We're talking an open mouth, a twisted tail, an uplifted paw, a pure, unfiltered representation of absolute royal power. On the reverse side, they placed a vase or a lamp, which symbolized prosperity. So they literally put the message of their power and their wealth right into the pockets of every single citizen. But you see, the lion wasn't just a political logo. It was deeply spiritual, too. This coinage was intrinsically linked to the rise of Narasimha, the half-lion, half-man avatar of Vishnu. Historical texts tell us that Narasimha worship actually began in coastal Andhra around the 4th century CE. So think about it. Every single time a Vishnukundin coin changed hands, it subtly spread this cult, which eventually ended up sweeping across the rest of South India. And this currency created a massive regional ripple effect. The Vishnukundin lion was so highly regarded that when the mighty Chalukyan king Pallavasan II came into power, he committed a little bit of 7th century copyright infringement. He literally copied the lion design and just slapped his own title on it in Brahmi script. These coins went on to become the prototype for the Eastern Chalukyan Dynasty, and because of a really thriving long-distance trade network, these lion coins have been unearthed as far away as Nagpur, Wardha, and Nashik. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Legacy of a Forgotten Dynasty. So you're probably wondering, how does an empire this culturally dominant just fade into obscurity? Well, let's walk through their pretty rapid timeline. They basically burst onto the scene around 420 CE, setting up their original capital at Amaravati before moving over to Vijayawada. By 461 CE, under King Madhavarman I, they're in the full swing of their cultural revival. But as we know, political fortunes are super fragile. By 624 CE, roughly 2 centuries after they started, their last king was defeated by the Chalukyas. Politically speaking, the Vishnukundins were completely finished. But culturally, they had already won. And honestly, here is the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Their enemies and their successors literally copied their blueprint. The Pallavas of Kanchi adopted their rock-cut temple designs. The Chalukyas, the very people who defeated them on the battlefield, adopted their roaring lion coins. And that massive transition they initiated from Buddhism and Prakrit to Hinduism and Sanskrit, that remained a permanent fixture in the region. They cemented an artistic and religious legacy that shaped South India forever. Which leaves us with this final thought. The Vishnukundins prove that you absolutely do not need to be the empire that survives the longest to be the empire that matters the most. Cultural legacy always outlives political power. So the next time you marvel at a famous monument or a widely accepted idea, ask yourself, which forgotten architects of our modern world are we overlooking today? Thanks for exploring this incredible slice of history with me in this explainer, and keep questioning the origins of the world around you.